Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I want to talk about a delightful debut novel, Sea Above, Sun Below by George Salis. I met George Salis through this YouTube channel, and we seem to share a lot of likes and so on when it comes to fiction. And then he introduced me to the chief editor and founder of the publishing house that brought this book out, Riverboat Books. And I've since been on the phone with that editor, and we'll possibly have a book coming out soon through them. So thank you so much, George, for making that connection for me. Let's talk about some of the other books that have come out through Riverboat. Riverboat is really publishing some interesting and well-written novels. They have Rick Harsh, The Skulls of Istria. This was a delightful read. I will put my a link to my Goodreads review in the description below. But what first brought my attention to Riverboat Books a couple years ago was their flagship book, The Mad Patagonian. Now, it says it's from Javier Pedro Zabala. It is actually written by Peter Damian Bellis, who is the person I'm talking about, the founder of Riverboat Books. This is one of the most incredible reads I have had in the last decade, and it needs to be more widely read. This was my second ever review with Rain Taxi, if you care to check that out. I loved this book. But anyway, this video is about Sea Above, Sun Below. It's interesting that very recently I reviewed Anne Carson's Autobiography of Red, because Autobiography of Red is a novel in verse, and it blends the modern novel with Greek mythology in much the same way that Sea Above, Sun Below does. There are three strands of mode or literary tradition that intertwine to bring this book together. One is the modern novel, two is Judeo-Christianity, and three is a heavy presence of Greek mythology. The title is of course a play on the maxim or aphorism, as above, so below, which was appropriated into the Lord's Prayer by the Message translation of the Bible. But we also find that it denotes the perspective of a skydiver when they are headlong. I liken it to Anne Carson's book because this really reads more like an extended prose poem or a novel in verse than it does just a traditional novel. There are no boundaries between reality, the fantastic, and dreams. And this gives George Salis a lot of room, a lot of space for the poetic and mythical mode of writing, which he is clearly adept at and has a knack for, and a real craft. Whenever I see an italicized paragraph coming up, I begin to grin sitting there, because I know I'm in for a real lingual treat. It reminds me of another one of Peter Damian Bellis's books. It's his second novel, and it's called Gods Among Gazelles. I only have a PDF of it on my Kindle. Once it's out in print, I'll procure it. But it's in this sustained mythical mode, much like Sea Above, Sun Below. In addition to Anne Carson, there were some other likenesses or kindred spirits that I picked up on, such as the philosophical writing of Thomas Ligotti. I've never read any of his fiction, but I've read The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, and the vocabulary and style is present here. Also, some of the films of Darren Aronofsky Most notably, I think it's called The Fountain, the one with Hugh Jackman. The Fountain, and even the most recent Mother really stuck out to me here. Ricky Ducournay, especially The Stain, and even Ingmar Bergman in some of his films, Fanny och Alexander, with Alexander's imagination really comes through here in some of the characters. Everything is alive. And laden with symbolism. The plot, if I had to try and get at it in my own words, there's a man named Adam, and in fact that is the very first word in the book, Adam, and it's really cool. You go ahead and see how everything is finely tuned and everything is deliberate in this novel. George has really formed a well-crafted world here. So we open with the name of the very first man, Adam, and he's falling. So he's of course a skydiver, but as he's falling, he ends up in this hypnagogia, which is a state between waking and sleeping, which is also something that Anne Carson brings up in her book. But anyway, he ends up in this in this vision, this prophetic vision, or however you want to say it, while he's falling. And we can see this as the fall of man. It's almost the same way that Milton starts out his poem. After this happens to him, he publishes a paper, and this attracts a group of followers. You could view them as nut jobs. Two of them, Lars and his sister, let's see, I wrote out some genealogies here. Lars and his sister Tabby have this deceased father whose rigor mortis is set in, and they're keeping him all sealed up in a room in their home, and they're believing in a miracle that brings him back, and so on. Then you've got lightning beginning to strike up from the ground, and there are these chosen people that come out of this. And then there's this series of just feverish, dream-like genealogies and stories of suffering and immolation occurs, and metamorphosis, and it starts to connect all of the central characters. You begin to get these fragments of, you know, the grandmother and grandfather, and then their children and their children. But we start off down here, well, we start off here, Adam and Evelyn, and then we get Isaac, their child, and then we go up here. And the most interesting thing is and the most interesting character, in my opinion, is Adam's father, who remains unnamed so deliberately that at the very end, when one of the spokespersons for the Icarus event, and Icarus should stand out there, whose waxen wings, of course, melted flying too close to the sun. But he announces the father's name, and there's this huge feedback or loud noise that obliterates hearing it. But I like this, like almost like a god figure, because in the end, this Adam's father fails his invention, and then Adam and Evelyn, which the very first three letters of Evelyn spell Eve, Adam and Evelyn are intertwined, and they're almost, the father has failed his invention, and now they're left on their own to find transcendence. So really just a cool way of taking all these different myths and traditions and putting this metaphor of skydiving right in the middle of it all, and constructing this really interesting novel that will keep you engaged from end to beginning. So some of the themes that emerge from that are, of course, religious faith and apostasy, immolation and metamorphosis, as I've said, and then parallax, which is, you know, seeing things differently from different perspectives. So characters looking at the same thing, but having completely different perspectives of it. And George does a really nice job of painting that out for us. his vocabulary is incredible. Just in general, the prose, the qualifiers are perfect. He understands the craft of the mot juste. But then also, I'm a sucker for specialized vocabulary, and we get tons and tons of specialized vocabulary. I can't tell you how many times I had to look up a word, and that is a good thing, in my opinion. Especially from zoology, George borrows a lot, and it really elevates the prose, because this is some grand, well-crafted prose. That begs for these $25 words and not these 1-cent words. Cannot express how much symbolism there is, how much allusion is going on. These are really the highlights. As you go through it, you'll begin to just piece together all these things. I would say that you really should be well rooted in Greek mythology and Judeo-Christianity. You'll really glean a lot more on your first read, but Salis does provide enough contextual clues to where you'll know what's going on. But I do challenge you to go, and if you don't know some of the myths that are pointed out here, and usually it's the title of the section that gives you the god or the personification, such as, let's see, Mary is Erebus, which is the personification of deep darkness and shadows. You've got Pathon, who's the unnamed father. On a more everyday note, I do like that they have, Charles and Adam have their hot wings with celery and kingly amounts of blue cheese. Yes, blue cheese. I live in North Carolina right now, and everybody is crazy about ranch with their wings. But I first cut my teeth on the buffalo wing in Buffalo, New York at the Anchor Bar with blue cheese, and this is the only way to have hot wings. I like some of these little standout statements that point out what George is doing in this book, such as, ideas have a lot of power, sometimes more than the actual thing. I love that. I love novels of ideas. And I've written this many times myself, not in these words, of course, but just that idea that ideas in themselves are often more transcendent than concrete things. And I think this is because with ideas are kind of like desire unfulfilled, and as long as desire remains unfulfilled, our expectations are always roused. Sometimes the allusion to Greek myth is very blatant, but other times it's more subtle, and I love this. I love this where Tessa's mother, Helen, it says that the missing girl's mother, Helen, lingered on the porch, rocking back and forth on a chain-suspended bench and knitting a cable-crown headband by day that she would unknit by night, beginning again the next morning. Well, this is exactly what Penelope does as she's stalling the suitors, waiting for Ulysses to return. She's at the distaff, knitting and then unknitting at night. We get a lot of psychoanalytical theory in here, just as with Du Corneille, where everything is kind of run through this Freudian filter. But then again, using skydiving as metaphor. It's true, we have a thirst for flight, as Da Vinci illustrated, but that's only the half of it. We crave, perhaps even more so, the fall. With the latter comes a sense of martyrdom, the former a kind of resilience. But it is more complex than that. There is a chaotic abandon, riddled too with the virtuous notion of a leap of faith. I don't know if this was necessarily intended, but I like these little Easter eggs, I guess we could call them. But there's a portmanteau of Neil Tyson and Bill Nye, and it says that he names a world-renowned cosmologist Dr. Nyson. again, the most interesting character to me is this shadowy figure who stays in his stacks in his study. And it's Adam's unnamed father. I'm a sucker for this type of character. And it says that, yeah, that too only lasted a few days before he crawled into other holes of human knowledge. And so I think this is, he just goes from project to project, and this last one was something involving pi. The one before that was something involving fractals. But then he constantly abandons these things to crawl into other holes of human knowledge. That's very eloquently stated. So again, Sea Above, Sun Below by George Salis. Go to Riverboat Books and pick this one up. You will not be disappointed. And it also says that George is working on an encyclopedic novel titled Morphological Echoes. And I can tell you that this is a book that showcases a mind of great learning. So go out and get it. George, great job. Can't wait to read your next book.